Hey there, I'm Juniper Owens, Director of the Academy of Integrative Mental Health, and also one of the hosts and the creator of our podcast, Integrative Conversations. And as part of our Rewriting Relationships podcast series, we interviewed practitioners who specialize in certain aspects of relationship. And today I wanted to share our conversation with Morningstar, the Naked Priestess.
I'm Morningstar. I am a spiritual teacher and healer, writer, and photographer who specializes in shadow work and intuitive restoration. You can find me at The Only Naked Priestess on Instagram. So my work is more and more being cultivated into shadow work, and I entered it because of my own trauma, my own, narrative of abuse and addiction, and really trying to uncover, why am I reactionary? Why do I not feel lovable? Why do I feel broken? How do I feel empowered after so much disempowerment? How do I step into that space? And so through the shamanic practices that I've done, the energy healing, all were with this intention of taking this journey into self to really understand. If I can understand me, if I can understand my trauma, then I can understand my children. I can understand my partners. I can understand the world, much better. So I have finally honed in on just calling myself a spiritual teacher. A shadow walker, which, the more that I do this work, the more that I'm able to see that there are healing practitioners that have a skill set specifically for going into shadow with someone, helping them navigate that, reattach their soul pieces that were detached from past trauma and bring them out of it. So I'm also a shadow walker, and I'm a writer, a photographer, an artist, a priestess, which is a label or a name that's has been given to me through the journeys that I've done spiritually with other goddesses, which is a big part of this work, is working with our hidden team. So that's a little bit about what I do in a nutshell.
Yeah. And I'm sure we can have a lot more conversation around a lot of
Yeah.
those pieces, but I'd like to first start with, and because I hear this a lot, and now it's like starting to float around in the mental health world, starting with Carl Jung, but like now modern day mental health practitioners are kind of like dancing around shadow work, but like, what is shadow work in your view? Because I think that
Yeah,
that's really a tough like concept to grasp.
for sure. And I think that's a big turn off of shadow work, because it's like, that's too much. It's too big. No, thank you. I already have enough going on. I can't do that. So my how I believe what I believe shadow work is it's essentially where we store every birth point of trauma. And trauma, you know, does not mean abuse. So trauma is too much, too fast. And so it's every one of those moments is stored in our shadow. And then every one of those moments creates a wound. And then that wound tells us a story of, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I'm too much, I'm responsible, I'm irresponsible, I'm broken, which all ultimately equal, I'm unlovable. So we have all of these points of trauma going, all the way back to being in the womb and beyond that, which would be a whole nother conversation, but infancy to adulthood. And so we carry with us any wound that we are not going back to look at, to accept, to offer non-judgment and unconditional love, because ultimately that's shadow work. That's what our shadow needs, is non-judgment and unconditional love. It stays active. And so, and then we avoid it. And so it's like avoiding scratch or a cut on our bodies. If we just ignore it, it's going to become infected, inflamed, red, and it's going to be a constant source of irritation. And that's exactly what the trauma points in our shadow do to us. They don't go away just because we're like, I don't see you. They're always there. And so to me, that's what shadow is. It's the home for every birth point of trauma.
That is the best explanation that I've heard. That was real. It just makes sense. And it was really concise. And like, I think that when I hear shadow being discussed, it's typically like the parts of ourselves that we don't like, or the banished parts, or the parts that we don't know, like what's underneath the iceberg is really classic training and dynamic modalities. But what I'm hearing that you're kind of expanding that to saying it's not just the parts that we don't know or don't like, it's the wounded parts.
Right.
And can you go a little more into that? And then we can kind of talk about that work in context of relationships.
Absolutely. So the kind of the known definition of shadow, which you're just saying, is that's a symptom of the wound. And so when we really start to look at, okay, the wound had a birth point. It was born at some point along our timeline. And that whatever age we were at that time, that age is constantly going to continue to pull us back to that spot, back to that spot, back to that spot, until we follow that child or that young adult or that adult to that spot where the wound originated, the original wound. And often the point we can kind of sometimes go back to that memory, right? We can go, okay, I can feel that something is here for me to look at and to address. So I'll go. And we can only get back so far, because we reach a point close to the entrance of the wound where whatever age we were when it happened, we can't go in any further. That's when we do this work of inner child. We do the work of this, where we begin to calm the wound, and we turn to whatever age we were, and we can offer gratitude. Thank you for bringing me here. I can see that you're afraid. I can see that you're also very brave. I've got it from here. And then we go in, as we are now in this moment, and we go further into that wound. And so we're going beyond, okay, well, I know this makes me feel unlovable, or it makes me feel these things. We go further into it, and we get into the why, which really, if we go in our original form, it's going to be too much. It was too much when it happened. So we can't make any progress if we go, try to go into that original wound with the original form. We have to go into it with the form that we're in now, which is empowered and in our highest self and confident. And so we can go back and we can really honor these moments and by seeing them. There's usually not much else we have to do. We just need to see them and say, I see you. And again, offer it that unconditional love and non-judgment, because ultimately we're just witnessing ourselves. And so by witnessing ourselves in those painful moments that we've then created all of these stories around, we're bringing ourselves home. So we're always whole, but those moments of trauma birth detachment. And so we're whole, but we're also detached. Which is where body dysphoria comes in, which is where low self-esteem comes in, which is where reactivity comes in. We're reacting to all of these detached places of trauma within us. So when we go back in as our current empowered self, as opposed to the disempowered child or whatever age, then we begin reattaching and we become more complete feeling.
Mm-hmm. And well, now I do want to hear about that work in context of relationship, and even like how you guide people, or being the shadow walker, what that looks like, because that's a relationship. So I'm really curious about that.
Absolutely. So in relationships, essentially, so if we are, I believe strongly and more in a daily shadow work practice, just like we would get up to meditate, doing a daily shadow work practice. So really beginning to normalize not being afraid of the dark, because that's essentially what it is. We're afraid of the boogeyman. We're afraid of, the monster in the closet and under the bed. And that's what we start to liken ourselves to. Um, the big bad me is going to come out. I can't look at that. I'll keep it tucked away, put the blanket up over the back of my head, and maybe, I'll be safe. And so a daily shadow work practice is key, because then it's the shadow work is the work of vulnerable transparency. So it's the art of not hiding, and it is an art and it's a practice. So it means it's not, we're not a perfection, we're a practice. So it's that constant showing up, because then we bring awareness to these trauma points. Because if we don't, and we're walking around as the infected cut on the arm, essentially what is happening in all of our relationships, even with self, is we have two wounded children or wounded souls literally fighting on the playground to be seen and heard and acknowledged. And so, shadow work in relationships is key, because if we're practicing shadow work, we're practicing not hiding. And if we're not hiding, then we're being honest and truthful. And if we're being honest and truthful, then we're creating safe space. And if we're creating safe space, then we're creating intimacy. And if we're creating intimacy, then we get to have the depth of relationships all around us that we're all really craving and dehydrated for, so, and when we're not practicing and when we are hiding, we're not being honest. We're not being honest with ourselves. We're not being honest with our partners. We're just not. We're living. There's a level of false that is happening at all times. And one of the requirements for safe space is authenticity, honesty, transparency. It creates trust, and all of that is a necessity for intimacy. So really, to me, more and more, the key for successful relationships, successful intimacy, is a shadow work practice, is not hiding, and doing it to where we're empowered in that practice. So simplifying it more and more, I'm like, we're all overwhelmed. Life is traumatic. It's, we're constantly in a place of too much, too fast, especially the last few years. And so really, if we can simplify our practices, then they're attainable. We're not adding more overwhelm. So the way that I work with my clients in this area is through a lot of mirroring work. We all mirror each other. And so, in my experience, people who are guiding others through shadow work are incredible light beings that are able to reflect back your clear gifts, your divine gifts, your potential, your possibility. We were able to reflect the magic back in you, which is a really powerful tool. We are constantly abusing ourselves. We're constantly being bombarded. So having a moment to just have our magical truth reflected back to us goes a really long way in, I can go look at that memory from my past that I've carried around as painful my entire life. You're right. I can go do that. And so empowerment is a really wonderful tool that I work with. And writing, putting pen to paper, being the curious observer. I think we often negate the power behind very simple practices. Observe yourself. Don't do anything. Just observe, just watch, and practice uncovering the layers of watching, and then learning where you begin to tune out because you didn't like what you saw. And so the more that we can practice these things, the more that we unearth these layers. And then that's shadow work. It's uncovering the layers. So working with questions every day, I ask myself every day, multiple times a day, what am I hiding from? What is my overwhelm made of? Why do I feel overwhelmed? What am I avoiding? Where am I being dishonest? And then just allowing myself to receive the information. Because if we ask ourselves questions, we will receive the answers because we have the answers. So it's essentially creating space to show up for ourselves.
Just as you're talking, I'm just reminded of like when those times you want to hide the most, I'll say is like in relation with others. And it says usually the people I love the most, like family members or partners or my children or whoever. I'm like, oh, stuff really comes out. I can be like on retreat and like out in the wilderness and, I've really got a hold of this. And then I come back and I'm like, oh, I just reacted in the same way. And so like, I'm just really curious of like, how is it in those relationships that you're observing and paying attention to patterns? Is that kind of how it works?
Absolutely. You're paying attention to patterns. And a big part of it too is taking responsibility. It's really learning that, okay, this person, family member, partner, friend said or did something, and I'm reacting to this. It has nothing to do with them. Where is it in me that I need to go sit with and look at? So it's that continuous cycle of coming back. And it's also recognizing that we're never reacting to anything but ourselves and the stories we create around an environment or situation anyway. But it's also being able to recognize in another person that they're in their own form of healing. They're doing their shadow work, they're not doing their shadow work. And so it's just this constant awareness. What you said makes me think of, so the points of trauma also they're not only the birth points of pain and suffering, they're also the birth point of our greatest gifts. Those are the moments that made us hypersensitive, that made us intuitive and psychic, that helped us develop our creativity and express it. So we're also not just hiding from our pain, we're hiding from how great we are, and we're really good at distracting ourselves. So, you say you're out in the woods, that's your place, that's your thing, you're vibing, it's quiet. We have in place so many structures that distract us from our own work.
I was just thinking, like you were talking about that wanting, the distractions are wanting to hide from yourself. And I think in relationship, a huge distraction is focusing on the other person's actions, the way that you're communicating. And I used to do couples counseling. That's how I got started actually. And I veered away from it because oftentimes when people come in, it's like way too late, but, and not everybody was committed to doing the work of relationship. It's very difficult. But that being said, I noticed that not only is that a distraction, but it is also a way of like really seeing yourself. So like, for example, what am I hearing very often with a client talking about their partner, really focusing heavily on them and their actions. And I think there's like a lot of buzzwords about boundaries and not taking certain things. And I think that's great. And there's reasons for it, but sometimes it prevents us from looking at like, okay, well, why am I responding so strongly? And one way that I've been trained to like notice that something might be shadow is if I'm having like a really strong reaction, like more than usual. That's good. Maybe a little clue to be like, oh, okay, maybe let me see what's going on here. What do you think about that?
I think you're absolutely right. Because we're constantly mirroring each other, and in relationships, so the wounded child, the wounded adult also has the protector with it. We can call it the ego, the inner animal. And so the ego is constantly going to be trying to, oh no, don't go out there. It's not safe. It's not safe. While the wounded child is like, okay, I'm not going to go out there, but I need to go out there. And so it's this push pull. And that whole dynamic creates projection. It creates reactivity. It creates protectiveness and defensiveness. And so an easy target, the easiest way to avoid ourselves is to look at someone else and point out all of their wrongs. And another thing too that, becomes really fascinating to me in relationships are the labels. You mentioned buzzwords, and it can make the work very challenging, because it's also combined with being able to trust your intuition. And that can be really challenging because our intuition is going to create a life and a story for us that doesn't look like anyone around us. And it takes radical courage to be able to live an intuitive life. You have to make that choice. For me, sometimes it's every moment of every day. And when we get into relationships and we're doing shadow work, we're going to look at boundaries. We're going to look at, toxicity. We're going to look at narcissistic tendencies. We're going to look at abusive tendencies. We're going to look at manipulation and gaslighting. And we're going to realize we all are on the spectrum somewhere. And in today's world, it's very easy to go, oh, well, that was abusive. That was toxic. My boundary is this. And that's all pretty and great, but it's very mundane. And it doesn't mean that we don't need boundaries. It doesn't mean that we stay in abusive relationships, but it means that when you're in a relationship and you're in a relationship with someone who is also has an awareness, they're doing the work, it's a mutual party that is going on, then you can begin to unpack some of those scary and often overwhelming labels that we so easily just toss out everywhere, which just gives us permission to continue hiding and blaming. I have a huge story of abuse in my life, and so being mirrored toxic or abusive or manipulative or gaslighting tendencies can really trigger me, and I rely heavily on my intuition, my team of guides, my spirit guides, to navigate those waters. Okay, is it abusive? If it is this someone else who is also doing their shadow work, and I can see them doing their work, and we're moving through this and we're expanding out of and beyond. But to be able to do that, we've got to get in there and look at these really uncomfortable themes, diagnoses, all of those things. When we're living in a culture that at the first sign of anything uncomfortable, it's gone, you're out. When I think we go in and go beyond.
I think that's beautiful, in and beyond, rather than out, because I often talk about leaning in. And I think it can be really tricky because you're talking about trauma and because people have been harmed and not protected. And when they should have been, especially as a child or as a baby or an infant or beyond, like you said, I think it can be really scary and tricky to find yourself leaning into a situation like that was dangerous for you before, where this new one might not be so much. And that's why I think having a guide or a relationship, like you said, with your allies. And for me, I have, I think I work with my primary attachment, which is like Gaia. That's like our primary kind of. And so I have a lot of resourcing in that way, but I can see that doing this work without that, having support and resource to your wholeness and beyond, can maybe be dangerous. I don't know. Or maybe, at least if anything, really scary. And that's why it's avoided, or it's bypassed spiritually. Sometimes I find shadow work can be a little bypassed, and because it's freaking hard and scary and weird to look at yourself, to have a mirror of oh, I was listening to one of our podcasts the other day that another person hosted, and I was convinced, I was oh my God, I'm a narcissistic parent. I'm the narcissistic parent. And then like, I'm like freaking out because I never thought of myself, oh, I'm so loving and this and that. And I was like, no, I have some tendencies. It was really hard. Actually, as my children have grown up, I've done the most shadow work I've ever done to look back and wow, how I harmed or ways that it's uncomfortable to even say it out loud to you, but it's just been my work over the last couple of years of like going and then forgiving myself and knowing that I'm human, but like also to know that there's things that I did that were based out of wounded patterns. So I think that relationship with children can offer a whole lot, but I'm rambling now. What have you seen with that?
Oh, I absolutely. I mean, there are moments, so absolutely. So shadow work can be daunting. And if you're doing it without resources and a team of support, whatever that team is that's been developed, I mean, it can be dangerous in the sense that you're just going to re-traumatize yourself. You're going to get triggered and triggered and triggered. And instead of moving, kind of going back to where I said at the beginning, to that point where we're led by the wounded child, we're just going to stay in that loop. We're not going to go in any further because we're just going to stay in that place where we're triggered. So it's extremely important to have a really solid and fluid spiritual practice that you are participating in, that you have, if you have people that you can call that understand the work, that's going to be really important. Any of those tools that we have, I think, are necessary. But I would say that for any healing work we're doing, we've got to have systems in place that support us, and one of the things that I found at the beginning of my trauma healing was, okay, how do I nurture myself? And I really attached myself to the word cozy and really created a cozy protocol, so it's just, bath, tea, cacao, hot chocolate, what a book, a warm blanket, what are these things that we always have on hand to support, because I think it's also too within shadow work, it's learning how to get comfortable being uncomfortable. It's okay if the trauma comes up. That's good. It's coming up because it's going out, and it might be uncomfortable and hurt and literally hurt your physical body for a little bit, but it's going to be okay. When I quit drinking 11 years ago, and 12, I think 12, this will be 12 years actually. And that was probably one of the most, this past year, and the moment I quit drinking was one of the most radical moments of shadow work that I did, because I went through my entire life, my drinking life, and looked at all of the moments, and a lot of those moments involved my two older kids. And so I chose to stand in those moments of great shame, discomfort, guilt, regret, and I had to stand and really look at those places and then go and make amends to my children, and acknowledge, not just to myself, but acknowledge to them where I had been, what I had done, and offer not just myself that transparency, but offering them transparency as well. And what I've seen from that is my kids are my best friends. We have developed a relationship, of an intimate relationship, by being transparent, and I really think that's the beauty behind a shadow work practice, is that we begin to offer that transparency to ourselves, and then we can offer that to those around us, our children, and we develop these beautiful connections and relationship, because it gives the other people permission to show up as themselves, their imperfect selves, and we
Yeah.
offer non-judgment and that unconditional love, and that's what we need.
Right. And that gives, like you said, the permission to honor that in the other. Because I had the same thing. I'm just imagining a conversation that I had with my son. I can see it. We were walking down. I was like, I'm just going to say it. And they were like, I thought it was so wise. I think he was like maybe 18, 19. He was like, well, I'm going to give you a gift of forgiveness. And I was like, oh, thank you. Like I get it. It was kind of fucked up and it hurt, and I'm still working on it. And I also forgive you. And it's like, of course, to forgive myself probably is a little more power, like it's going to take more time, but it was really beautiful and talk about that intimacy. And I think that's when we bring up relationship, like when you say like standing in that radical, like honesty, vulnerable parts, like what that does for the other person, what that must feel like, and offering an invitation for them to do the same. And like, how often do we get to do that in close relationships?
Absolutely. And that's so much, I believe, of what our trauma points taught us was that, oh, it's not okay to show up as myself. And so that's the beautiful work of shadow, is that we start showing up that way, and we very quickly develop the relationships that have space for that. And we very quickly remove the relationships that don't have space for that. So we really cultivate this beautiful community of like-minded, like-hearted individuals. And, and then we can look at it from the collective as well. We all experience the collective energy and what is going on collectively. And if we are, I think sometimes we can dismiss the power of individual work, because it's never individual work. It radiates out, it ripples so far that it affects the collective in very massive ways.
Absolutely. And I see that happening a lot with people that are doing work on decolonizing or unsettling their own mind and body, or that work feels like just straight up shadow work from possibly ancestral all the way on to now. And it is deeply painful. And another thing, people just want to avoid, oh, that's not me, or no, I don't have that inside of me. So let me, like, as we're kind of closing just for today, can I ask if you, I don't know if this is something that you can do, but like to maybe share an example, maybe take away names or something that feels like appropriate. But I think that might be helpful for people to maybe hear an example of what shadow work within relationship could look like, maybe of a client you've had or within your own experience.
Absolutely. So I worked with a couple for several months last year, and they would come in. They had this beautiful, beautiful connection, beautiful connection. And they would come in, and I mean, it was just this agitation all the time, this agitation. She wasn't seen and heard. He wasn't seen and heard. Then there were all of the feelings created around that. And so what I did, because I could clearly see, I was like, okay, these are active wounds that are mirroring one another and then battling for the attention. So it was, what was needed was creating a space of teaching how to listen, teaching how to be the container, and then alternating that. So oftentimes it's both people not pausing and going at it. So we needed to create pause. And so I sat them down in front of one another in lotus position, and kind of used a format of nonviolent communication, and had one of them start and gave them the format of I feel, I need. And so, and communicating, it's like, okay, well, when you communicate a need, that does not mean it is the other person's responsibility to fulfill that need. You are simply communicating. And so one of them would start, and they would go through their dialogue. And it was a process of becoming clear of, okay, well, what do I feel when you did this? And then what do I need? And watching the other person, when the information was presented that way, watching the other person start crying, because they were then able to see their person show up in that true form of the wound. They were able to see enough that they were then able to offer them, reflect back, oh, wow, my intention was never to harm you. I can really see that you are hurting. I can really see how much pain you're in. And within 30 minutes, an entire situation is diffused, and then doing the other. And then you really begin to see this awareness, have this awareness of, oh, wow, this was a wound. This, I was reacting, projecting, because the person is mirroring all of this stuff that we then take and say, well, you're doing this to me, and throwing it back. You're doing this to me. You're doing this to me, without this self-reflection. So in that moment of pause and creating space for two people to hear, to communicate in a way that was not defensive, and to hear in a way that was not defensive, opens up the portal to be able to go into those memories, to be able to go into your timeline, because you've now been seen and accepted in that inflammation. And so now you're calm enough to then be able to go inward and go, okay, what else is here for me? And one thing that I would love for everyone to remember as often as possible is that we are a practice, not a perfection. It's about showing up and being present.